Okay, well, I will keep an eye on the attendees list and let people in as they arrive, but if it's okay, we can go ahead and get started.
Sure.
All
With the
right.
co-chair's permission, I'll read the COVID statement here and we can go from there.
Please.
So due to the COVID-19 pandemic and state of emergency, this meeting is being held by a live video teleconference pursuant to 2020 Senate Bill 150 and in accordance with KRS 61826 because it is not feasible to offer a primary physical location for the meeting. And with that, I'll turn it over to the co-chairs to go through the agenda.
All right. Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
See your smiling faces. I wish we could see them in person, but that day will come, I'm sure. So I would like to just get approval of the minutes if everybody has had time to review them. Are there any questions or concerns? All right, with that, do I hear a motion to approve our minutes from our last meeting? Don, do I have a second?
Second.
Vice Mayor Kay? Thank you. Minutes approved.
And then if we could also interject that Fred Cromes with Lexington has joined us, and he is joining our group and is replacing Carrie Butler, who has moved on from Lexington. Thank you, Fred, for being with us.
Thank you for having me, and hello, everyone. I know I see some familiar faces here. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have of me. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Great to have you, Fred. Craig, you want to carry on?
Well, sure. I mean, we've got a tight timeline and we've got a lot to talk about. So in the interest of keeping on our timeline with approval of the minutes, we'll go on to project schedule. Hopefully everybody got the agenda by email from Craig. And Craig, could we move on to the project schedule and discussion of the growth model scenarios with the Stantec team?
Certainly, I'd be glad to introduce that. Really, I am just doing a very quick introduction in the interest of time and passing this along to Mark Butler and John Butcher with the Stantec team. They will be providing a project schedule overview for you today. They will be discussing 3 growth model scenarios that they've been developing, and we will go from there. So I'm not sure if Mark has actually joined the meeting yet. Mark, are you in the room?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you see me?
Okay, I see you now. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I guess, yeah, I'm trying to figure out who else is on here. I was hoping everybody else is on. So hello, my name is Mark Butler. I am the project manager for Stantec. And I'm going to try to share my screen real fast. Hopefully this will work. And let me know if you can see the schedule. Okay.
Yes.
So this is our original schedule from our response. We started in earnest at the beginning of this month. So month 1 is October. And we have laid this out as according to the tasks that were in the RFP, which we are going to stay within that basic framework. And so that circle number 1 is this meeting with the Sustainable Growth Task Force to really get the ball rolling. We have had several discussions with Craig's office and with the planning staff, and we're already underway acquiring data from the planning department and from the PVA, and working with the Department of Revenue to get other types of data as we can develop strategies to acquire them. And so today we are again laying out our basic project approach and strategy and schedule. As you can see, moving in the next few months, we're going to be working mainly in the areas of developing data, working on developing our existing conditions and growth trends report that basically summarizes and synthesizes that data, as well as beginning our public and stakeholder outreach program. And all of that will begin to coalesce into the final report, that existing conditions report, which will be available at the end of the year or the beginning of January. And meanwhile, while we're doing that, we have our partners with Urban 3 and MXD will be developing the scenario models, or the models for which we will analyze scenarios. We'll also be doing some other framework analysis with that as well. And we will then present those scenarios towards the end of February, beginning of March. Those scenarios we'll discuss in a few minutes, but basically, I think if we look at month 6, which is March, that we'll have 2 workshops. In fact, that's one change to the schedule. We should probably show 6 twice, because we're going to have one initial set of workshops that will focus on the first 2 scenarios, and then a second workshop that will focus on the third. And those will occur relatively close together. And then ultimately, as we're developing this data, especially the GIS components of this data, we'll be putting that in a accessible format and providing a user guide back to the planning staff and to the task force and everybody involved, really. That will happen towards month 7. And then as we're working through these scenarios with the task force, with stakeholders, we will be really identifying and then refining these criteria that we're using in our analytical framework to see how we're using them within the scenarios, and analyzing and evaluating the scenarios. And as they coalesce, we'll be developing that criteria as a list, or as a definable outline, which we will then provide towards the end of May. And then we'll also be at the same time developing the whole package of the framework of how we do this process of analysis, and so that it can be implemented again and repeated in the future. So our goal is to finally finish up in June with a final presentation and a final report. As you can see, there's also an optional task. We're not crossing that bridge quite yet, to develop a more formal data clearinghouse. That's as of right now, that's not within our scope, but it could become part of our scope as we move forward. So that's the basic schedule, to starting now, having our existing conditions report at the beginning of the year, having our workshops, rolling out our scenarios in late February, March, and really working through those scenarios so that we have developed a list of evaluation criteria and a framework in which to do these kinds of evaluations in April, May, and culminating in the final report in June. So I will pause there if there are any questions or comments before I move on to the project strategy with these scenarios themselves. All right. Well, John is going to probably be able to call in a few minutes, but he's running a little bit late, so I'm going to deal with the scenarios, or describe the scenarios as well. And I will move on here to the next, the basic rule that we have been directed to operate under, which is that our study is not to make an explicit recommendation or to even analyze the expansion of the urban service boundary as a specific item. And the main reason for that is we do not want to combine that kind of debate with the process that we're trying to work on here, which is to focus on developing the framework and identifying the criteria that will inform when an expansion would be necessary. And so how we do that will be by analyzing specific build-out scenarios for the land use strategies for land within the urban service boundary. And so we basically are seeing how, with various scenarios, how quickly or how much time and with what other conditions occur as we approach the exhaustion of the land inventory we have currently. And if we can all agree on the criteria, if we can all agree on the method of evaluation and the weights we put to that criteria, we can all have our own preferred or presumed land use strategies that we believe are more likely to occur, but we all agree on the basic metrics. We all agree on how we measure those different strategies, and the policy is left to to you all, to the Planning Commission, to the council. We're trying to just develop the framework, and in order to do that, we obviously need scenarios to test. So we are moving forward with these scenarios to test, but these scenarios are, again, more like best described as build out scenarios of the current urban service boundary land area. So just to roll them out, here they are. We have 3. And again, we were talking about presenting the first 2 and then coming back with the third. So the first 2, number 1 is a historical trend, a business as usual land use pattern, in which we look at the data from the planning department, from the building records in the recent past, whether that's 10 years, 20 years, and say, if we maintained that level of development based on the economic conditions we're seeing today and expect in the future, like when will we exhaust the land supply, the inventory for the various land uses that we see in Lexington. And obviously that could mean that we exhaust some forms of land use more quickly than others. However, the idea is not for us to make any presumptions or judgments about those trends, but to really just carry those trends forward. And that's almost like almost a default historical baseline scenario. And so we'll see some metrics will be the time of exhaustion, and also the various fiscal economic impacts on the revenues based on those land uses, and also other community impacts as well. So scenario 2 envisions we follow a strategy that employs the policy changes rolled out and adopted in Imagine Lexington. So this is it is obviously the adopted plan. So it is in fact almost the policy plan, but it will also obviously require certain conditions being met, certain things continuing to move forward, certain changes in how development occurs for it to be fully realized. That expectation would be that if we follow these policy changes, we should see more time elapsed between the now and the exhaustion of various land use inventories, etc. So that is working with the planning department, working with stakeholders, working with the task force to faithfully, in good faith, implement the land use plans of Imagine Lexington to see how far that gets us down the road and what are the implications fiscally, community-wise there as well. And then that should help us, because I think all of that is relatively common ground. We can all agree on the data we have for historic trends. We can agree on what's in Imagine Lexington. We should start to be able to see how these metrics identify themselves, what we need to really come to a consensus of what's valued, and see what else just kind of emerges as important factors, criteria, and framework-wise. And then we move on to the third scenario, which would be like a challenge scenario to say, what if we did everything within the realm of rational possibility to stay within the boundary, to really maximize the efficiency of the inventory we have? It would require some bold and aggressive policy changes that we haven't yet even contemplated. And we'd have to identify, and how far would that get us? And what would the fiscal consequences of those different policy changes be? What would be the community impacts? And so that's going to be a more exotic approach where people have different ideas and different opinions of the the effectiveness of any particular policy or the feasibility of a particular policy. And that's where we're going to be trying to bring in people that can talk about those ideas and bring them back to you all. So,
Excuse me, Mark,
yes.
this is Ann. I think your one of your toughest quests that you're going to have is coming up with the amount of inventory that we have available within the urban service area that all groups agree with. That's going to be a pretty good task for you, I think. But I love your idea on the maximum efficiency. I think that's really interesting.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that comment. That is definitely one of the challenges that we've already identified and are working with the planning staff and trying to figure out the best strategies for identifying underutilized land, and obviously vacant land, but also underutilized land, and recognizing what is more ripe for development, redevelopment, or reuse than others. And I agree. And I think that we're also, as at the same time, there are some opportunities to work with the city on as they work on their exactions program to see how that measure of inventory is moving. And so we have other avenues that we can enter into defining or identifying every strategy or every expectation of what's happening today going forward. But I agree. I think that people are going to have a difference of opinion of what is in that inventory.
And then also seeing that the city would consider looking at some rezoning on some of those lands for the maximum efficiency of those pieces of property.
Yes.
So we will definitely have, at the end of the day, I mean, step one is all of the data gathering and analysis that the Stantec team is working on right now. Step two will be developing these scenarios that you have on the slide before you today. And those are really with an eye toward gaining consensus of the community, the task force, and council members, and so on. Once we get that done, that will help, or once we receive adequate input on that, and we have some kind of consistent feedback on that, that will give us what we need to start developing those objective criteria. So it's really getting to that point. But once we have those criteria, the last step that will be in this study as well, and Mark, you can add to this if you'd like, but there'll be specific policy recommendations that accompany this as well. So if the community's decision and this task force's direction is choice 2 on the screen, for example, we would also put forth in the study recommendations to get us there with a timeline attached. So that's all intended to be part of the overall study. Thank you.
Right.
When Mark was speaking, he stated, we would agree upon the criteria. Who specifically would agree upon the criteria? Would this committee, would it be by majority vote, or how would that be defined?
Criteria related to developing the scenarios, or which part?
Criteria related to triggers, I would.
Right, or for the objective indicators. So this, I believe this task force, together with the input from the Planning Commission and from Council, will come up with those objective criteria. Those should be, they should become a bit self-evident once we get to the point where we have a scenario that everybody agrees on. The process of coming up with those objective criteria should be as objective as the criteria themselves. In other words, it should be data driven, and that part of this study, there shouldn't be any great controversy associated with that. The most community discussion and discussion during these meetings will likely be related to those scenarios that you have on the screen right now, coming to a community consensus about what build out essentially means for the community in order to come up with those criteria. So hope that answers
Craig,
the question.
if I can I jump in I've kind of raised this concern before. I guess I'm going to keep raising it. If the language, which we heard initially, is what the criteria will be when we expand, it assumes that there's going to be an expansion. And it seems to me the question is what the criteria might be when we would consider an expansion. And that's related to, again, something I've said before, the question of the timeline of sustainability. My concern is if we have a set of criteria that say when X happens, that will trigger an expansion, that we can only do that so many times, and that eventually we won't be able to do it. And then the long-term sustainability issue gets raised. So that's the larger framework and context that I think we ought to be paying close attention to.
If I could say something to respond to that, I agree with you that it's really about establishing the point in which the consideration becomes, we have developed these scenarios. And again, these scenarios are more, I won't say prototypes or theoretical. They are intended to be real trajectories that we measure and continue to measure over time, whether it's, when we hand this back off to the planning department. But that the idea is, you're right, that it's not that we've hit this thing and say, now we can expand, or now we should expand. It's now we can say, well, based on the criteria that we've had, we now agree on that this scenario is at this point, that we have, according to the business as usual scenario, we have exhausted these land uses. And now it's time for the policy people to consider what they want to do with that information or with that understanding. But it's still, that's the point of the consideration, not the actual expansion. And I think one of the ways I look at this is that it's really just a method for examining your trajectory. You have 3 lines on the map going out, and as you go forward in time, you can see which trajectory you're closer to being on, so that you can make pivots from one to another as you see the trajectory where the policy wants to really go. So if you were hoping, if the goal or the recommendation of the task force of the other stakeholders that will make the final recommendation here was to say, let's do the Imagine Lexington, and as we go forward in the next few years, we see, well, we're actually more on the business as usual trajectory. What do we need to do to shift or change that trajectory? Or what the economic conditions have been different than, as we've moved forward or have changed, and how does that change our, the basic trajectory of where we are, even if we were on the same, even if we were doing the same policy implementation that was recommended or was preferred. I kind of look at it as more of a triangulation of where you are by giving these guidepost lines going out, as opposed to saying, picking one and saying we expand when we hit this point.
Mark, could I make a comment?
Absolutely.
I'm a little confused by your analysis scenarios. For the fact, actually, if I'm not mistaken, the community at the last comp plan, the community meaning the council, the planning commission, and the community at large in that exercise, voted and adopted number 2. So that's the track we're on, is my understanding in planning, is Imagine Lexington. Business as usual, number 1, would be to go backwards and do something, some old way, or sort of abandon what we voted on and determined to do. Now 3 is intriguing. That's kind of maybe something slightly different. So this puzzles me a little bit. Aren't we sort of mandated to do number 2?
Well, the way I look at it is we can all best intentions are too. That's the adopted plan.
Okay,
However, for the purposes of scenario building, we can establish what would be the convention as developed historically, and where that gets us. So that sets like the bottom line, that because the truth is a plan without actual implementation is just a
plan.
policy idea, right?
yes.
So we can see that if we keep saying mañana, we're going to get to that new policy implementation on the next development, or this time we're still going to develop according to the historic ways, we will run out of land faster than necessarily the Imagine Lexington plan would foresee. And so I think we're trying to establish that baseline that's and I use the word not controversial, not in the sense that it isn't, we're trying to encourage or suggest that that's a preference. We're just using that baseline of historic trends to say, this is one edge of the trajectory. Imagine Lexington is a balanced adopted plan in the center, and there is a even more aggressive trajectory over here as well. And somewhere we're going to, as we collect data that we all agree on is the data that's transparent, as Craig explained, we can see where we are on those three trajectories, which one we're closest to. Are we actually accomplishing the goals of the Imagine Lexington plan, or are we actually developing according to the more conventional pattern that we've historically seen? Or conversely, have we seen an opportunity to do something even more creative or aggressive than what was even in the Imagine Lexington plan, and we're actually ahead of schedule by comparison to the Imagine Lexington plan? But I think it is important to recognize that we may not achieve, with all good intentions, we may not achieve the level of progress that we should be expecting under Imagine Lexington, and this will be kind of a way to recognize those guideposts of where we are.
If I can add to that, because it's a great comment, Mr. Robinson. Imagine Lexington, and Jim Duncan, feel free to add to this if you'd like. But Imagine Lexington really provides lots of flexibility in what can happen on any specific site. So what we're trying to do with that scenario, as I understand it, is come to some agreement of what that may look like community-wide. So it's really applying the plan. The first option we have there that we're calling business as usual on this slide is really looking at current development patterns and carrying those through. So they would be consistent with the plan. We're not going to propose anything that would be inconsistent with our own plan or our own code, but it would be without any of the innovation or any of the suggestions that are put forth in the Imagine Lexington.
And Don, Jim Duncan here, sitting in the room with Frank Penn. If I could just even more basic, say what Mark and Craig have just said. Imagine Lexington, you are absolutely right, Don, is the adopted policy of this community. But that policy depends on a lot of changes to be made to our regulations, our zoning regulations, our development regulations, and the way we even review development at all. And if those changes are not being made, then we are not implementing the policy of Imagine Lexington. And I mean, to be frank, if those recommendations are getting stalled at the Planning Commission level, or if they're getting stalled at the council level for updates to the regulations, then we're not going to make it. So that's in part what I believe this helps to punctuate, as a reminder that the community, as you said, Don, has accepted Imagine Lexington as its development policy, but that also means we have to accept the changes that will be coming along with that.
So that's a commitment from our city and our council then. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, ma'am. Certainly the council, through adopting the goals and objectives, the Planning Commission through adopting the rest of the plan, have indicated that they expect these changes. I mean, you could even call some of them bold and aggressive in number 2, that they expect these changes to be made in order to advance development opportunities in Lexington. And if we don't make those changes, then we're business as usual until we do.
Thanks for the clarification.
I had a question. So these analysis scenarios are looking at land use absorption, or are they looking at the ways in which we've approached the question of adjusting the urban services boundary? Because we've only done that once, and that was in '96. So can you better explain what these scenarios, what will be the data used in these scenarios?
Well, at the very basic level, it's parcel level data, an inventory of land uses. It's a understanding of the number of units by land use type that is expected or targeted, whether they're housing units or commercial or industrial space. So in that sense, yes, it's a land absorption analysis at that basic level. And it also it can also come to encompass more than that as we talk to stakeholders and other folks that say this is a relevant aspect of any type of land use analysis that ultimately is supposed to come, be able to evaluate our ability to efficiently or effectively make land use decisions, whether it's an expansion of the boundary or simply changing the policy for land uses we already have inside the boundary. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Mark, I would add also, I think that would also include building permit data, development patterns, the density, those types of things that are currently being developed in the community.
Yes. I have to make one point, a technical point. I can't really see anybody with my screen. Can I go ahead and stop sharing my screen so I think I get that panel back? Okay. There we go. All right. This makes it a little easier to see who's talking.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Karen.
I had my hand raised on my blue hand. I guess I'm too used to doing the blue hand thing. So I'll be rude and interrupt. I just wanted to make one very good point to Mr. Robinson's point earlier in the current environment now, which is, every 2 years this council does change, and the desires of that council sometimes do change. And just as we've seen that the community asked us to pass Imagine Lexington, in theory, we did. But as we have moved to implementing those things, we've gotten significant pushback from the same people who have asked us to hold that same boundary. So in theory, what people want maybe in development over there, once it becomes their backyard, sometimes have a different feeling about implementation. And I just want to acknowledge that's real. And the theories of the community development are one thing, seeing it happen is something else. And I think as we move to implementation of 2, there will be maybe not as much whole support as there may have been to, yeah, this sounds great, until we see what we're getting. And I just want to acknowledge that now as opposed to later.
Very good point.
Well, and I do think that is one of the again, one of the goals of this study is to provide an analysis tool that you guys can use regularly going forward. And as a result, the framework will include how you would change criteria or the weight of criteria as people say, this is now more important to me, or this is less important to me, or this is something that we didn't think about 4 years ago, but it's definitely moved up in the interim. So that's kind of been our charge. It's not just to make a one-off analysis that is fixed in time to 2020 going forward, but just really the framework is as important as any recommendation or any actual final analysis that we do. It's to kind of separate the methodology for how these things are considered from the actual policy decision, so that people can at least agree on, well, we have a framework for evaluating these ideas.
And if I might interject.
Excuse me?
I wanted to ask Mark, things are going to change post-COVID. Are you all going to try to look forward and think what those changes might be? Are we on our own with that? What is the status of that going forward?
Well, I believe, again, the idea is that we were all, the framework is intended to be like identify the data that we will consistently use over time to make decisions about not only where we want to go, but where we actually are. So as for right now, yeah, it's hard to like establish some baseline during this COVID period, but we still know that the general data points are going to be the same. It's going to be the land use inventory. It's going to be the relative economic indicators that cities and regions use. It's going to be population and census statistics. All those things will be the data points. And having established the criteria, having established the framework for evaluation, you put that new data in, and you should see the outlook as it currently is. Now, from a practical standpoint, we do have our economic advisors, the MXD and even Urban 3, they're going to take into consideration the trends in COVID and how that's affecting trends going forward. So we will address what we believe would be a reasonable correction of post-pandemic implementation or in the measures of the pandemic. But ultimately, the value of the framework will be that it should be taking in new information all the time and should be being updated in a way that the data is simple to understand, the data is simple to acquire, and it's we agree on what it is and how we're going to run it through the framework.
That's the answer I was looking for. I didn't want us to start speculating on what it's going to look like going out forward. I want us to get the data and live with the data. Thank you.
Sure.
In the interest of making sure we leave enough time for public comment, would it be appropriate to move on to public and stakeholder engagement at this time? Mark, can you?
Yes, please. That we have Ed Holmes and Ryan Holmes from EHI Consultants, and they're leading that aspect of the study. So I'll turn it over to Ed.
Okay, thanks, Mark. As Mark had discussed the three different scenarios, and the stakeholders will obviously vary somewhat depending on the stakeholders, the scenarios that we're proposing. But we're, given the restrictions we have with COVID, we do hope to get a broad base of stakeholders tailored more to the different scenarios that we have. And we'll look at some of the traditional stakeholders when we start looking at like scenarios 1 and 2. And what we're hoping to do on scenario 3 is to reach out maybe some of the non-traditional stakeholders, and that could be universities, professional associations, other communities in other cities that are looking at some creative ways to do development and keep it within a defined urban service area. Also, as we look at build out within a very contained or constrained community, we have to look at what those impacts are going to be on housing costs, affordable housing, those types of things. So we've got to bring in some inclusive stakeholders that are going to look at the creative ways, but yet maintaining a sense of affordability so that we don't push a limited resource of land out of those that are, can least afford it or need it. So we're going to tailor our stakeholder engagement to the three scenarios from a traditional group to a more creative group, and look outside the boundaries of Lexington to incorporate, see what other communities are doing, and actually include them as stakeholders. And that could include communities not too far, maybe Cincinnati or for Louisville, look at what we have in terms of some maybe urban development, urban developers that are building more intense, the development within a community. And then we'll also look at what's happening in terms of the professional associations, whether it's ULI, Urban Land Institute, or American Planning Association, and maybe look at some smart growth techniques as well. So that's what we're planning, is sort of a broad-based stakeholder engagement that will be based on the different scenarios that we're using.
So then I'll jump in, and I think the purpose of today's discussion, I'll be brief, and what we're doing to host some of these engagement activities, we're going to use a platform called Social Pinpoint. And so the beauty of this is that it's one centralized platform that we can use to house all the information. So of course we can have things like project timelines, any type of meeting minutes, anything that we want to push out to the public, they can all come to this page. And so we'll look at things like hosting forums that we can do virtually. We'll do things, in that case, we can propose a topic and then have everyone comment. And of course, as us being the moderators, we can remove comments if we deem them to be offensive or anything to that nature. But we'll have surveys. So again, the good thing about this is that we don't have to use like a Survey Monkey link. Everything's one centralized platform, and everything all goes back to the Social Pinpoint. There is an interactive mapping feature. I know John and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and so we're not quite sure if we want to go that route as far as having some interactive mapping just yet. So that's one feature we can implement if we want to, if we do feel it's appropriate to use that feature. And so, and there's also, virtual town halls, things like that. And so there's a plethora of tools that we can use for this under the Social Pinpoint platform. So we're excited. We're working through this on the back end to get everything set up. So I think it'll probably be appropriate on a separate meeting to kind of walk through that and give you all a brief demonstration of how that'll look when it goes out to the public.
And we're also identifying what we think stakeholder organization or groups may look like and who they are, and building upon some of those that were utilized in Imagine Lexington as well. So we're putting together a database of types of stakeholders at this point in time, and then we'll actually identify who we think would be the appropriate contacts for those. And as usual, neighborhood associations will always play a critical role in this.
And the web.
Any questions?
As far as the hosting of the website, Craig, the city's responsible for that portion. Is that right? How does?
So the consultant in this case is actually creating the website, and then there will be a maintenance task that the city will keep up with that I will be working on as staff. But we have the assistance of the consultants in actually setting up that Social Pinpoint website.
That's what we're currently building right now.
We'll end up with a good interactive product that way, I believe.
Ed, is there a way that you can let the committee know the list of stakeholders just in case we might think of somebody that you might not have thought of?
Yes, I think, but before we go live with any of the stakeholders, we'll present that back to the committee. And
okay, right.
So thank you. Ryan, just a little bit more on your pinpointing, social mapping, if you will. One of the key, I think, principles needs to be that people in the community feel like it was a representation of the entire city, that it's not just, stakeholder groups or those, it's the mom who takes her kids to school, it's those in other apartment areas, et cetera. And so how are you going to make sure, or at least be able to show that we're going to get that information?
Right. So, this is just one of our, planning aspects for toolkits that we have. So you have the virtual platform with the Social Pinpoint, but there also be in-person engagement too as well. So for those who are hard to reach or who don't respond well to kind of a virtual engagement tactics, we will be reaching out to them through various means. So anytime we can get out, of course, under CDC guidelines, we'll get out in person and reach the communities that way.
That's helpful. And I know it's hard right now. I mean, I'm trying to do neighborhood meetings and engagement, and it's just really challenging. I'm trying to tell the public what we're doing be transparent, ask their input, all under guidelines that aren't necessarily friendly to any of those things.
Right.
I feel your pain. I'm wrestling this myself, so I don't say this critically by any means, but the other thing that I think is important is trying to make sure that it's not used inappropriately. And when surveys aren't done well, or when input's not done well, not quantifiable, or it's used, when a certain group takes over a certain issue, then no longer helpful or useful. So those are things that I know you're probably thinking of. I'm just making sure I'm asking.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think it's important, like Ed said, before we go live with any surveys or anything public, especially mapping or anything like that, I think it's good to vet it through this committee here. And in that way, we can cross our T's, dot our I's before we go public.
Right.
Just to add to that, if I may, I think any sort of survey tool that we use on the site is going to be very specific. We have, I think the Vice Mayor had pointed out during our very first meeting that we have lots of community input that we've received as a result of the comp plan being adopted in the last couple of years. So we're looking at not replacing that, but building on that and trying to speak with some additional stakeholders that perhaps weren't as represented the first go around with that. So again, any sort of survey that's done, I think would be very targeted towards specific questions that we're trying to get the answer to, rather than just general background information.
When surveys are done, how do you ensure that the survey taker is a resident of Fayette County? Is there any risk
we
there?
we can propose that question through any type of question. If we want to do it by location, if we want to have the participant enter in their zip code or any type of location based question, we can do that. And then on the back end, we'll start to quantify that data to make sure that they're in Fayette County or.
Social Pinpoint has some additional features that allow us to track that if we choose to turn them on. One of the things that I think is a challenge, though, is that once you turn some of those features on, you have a lot of people who are no longer willing to take your survey. And so that will be something that we'll need to balance in that, how important is it that we know exactly where people live versus having a more robust response rate on the survey. So it's something just to consider. We've seen that in the past, that the more specific you get about personal information on the survey, the fewer responses you get.
Sure. Good point. Dennis?
I'm curious about this survey. It sounds like to me it's an opportunity to stuff the ballot box. How do you prevent people from participating more than once? How do you prevent very active groups from soliciting and recruiting? It's not a very statistical or analytical way to do it, sounds to me.
Ryan, do you want to answer that one, or do you?
Oh no, I thought you were going to say something, John.
Well, I think that's a very valid point. And again, there are some things that we can do the way we ask questions and some of the features that we turn on. But the reality is, the way we do surveys, it's very difficult to get, what a researcher would consider an appropriate sample. And I don't know that that's necessarily what we're going for. It would be great if we have equal representation across all possible groups, but we don't have the responsibility that an academic researcher would have in terms of what our sample looks like. And I don't know that we have the ability to ensure that. We'll do the best we can to circulate the the survey across the community. But it is something that we always struggle with in planning projects. Is it's more of a convenient sample than it is, anything else.
I think the other thing to keep in mind there is that the survey will be just one of the tools that we're using for outreach. So the primary tool, I think, will still be either some type of live Zoom meeting or in person, if we can, meetings that you would traditionally see for planning efforts and obtain people's input. on the process and on the options that we're presenting that way. I think the survey should be seen as supplemental, and the Stantec team, I'm sure, can add to that, but that's certainly, the survey is not intended to be our only means of receiving community input during this process.
Yeah, I don't think the survey is designed to reach a consensus. I think it really is designed to get some concepts and ideas at that point. So we're not trying to tally up the surveys. It's just another form of getting some input.
Vice Mayor Kay.
Yeah, if I can kind of add to the same point, I would urge real caution about using any survey that is a convenience survey. What happens, and we've had adequate experience in this community with it, is that you can put all the caveats you want about how it's not scientific and it's not representative and it's only a convenience survey and so on. But there is a risk that the survey is used as an advocacy instrument. And whether it is used that way or not, the people who like the outcome will claim that it's very valid, and the people who don't like the outcome will question its validity. So I think it requires some careful thought. Thank you.
I completely concur with Vice Mayor Kay, and that's why I brought up the point, is that we've seen it used too often to fit purposes that aren't reflective of the intent. And that's what I get nervous about. We certainly want people's input, and we certainly want to make sure that it's gathered in such a way that we know they're a resident here and they have a valid interest in participating in their issues. Once you get too far off that road, it is, there are things we use as fact around, we throw them around as facts that were not facts. And that's never retained, as it moves forward. So thanks.
If I could interject one point, is I think that's also part of the reason why we're trying to separate the debate about expanding the boundary from the purpose of the study of developing the framework. We can get survey information, like we can use a survey, for example, as one tool to identify a new idea, but we don't necessarily have to for the framework. But hopefully the framework will the foundation of the framework will be the better data. That's not really up to somebody's popular opinion. If the data doesn't, again, meet the standards of being easily accessible, readily understood as for what it actually means, then it really won't serve the framework. The policy will be left to the policy fights. The whole point of this study in some way is to remove the policy fight and the advocacy of who can create, garner the larger, popular support from the tool development itself, that everybody, even if they have separate opinions or different opinions, can agree on, well, we understand how this tool works, and this is the tool that we've agreed upon meets the community's need to have a more objective approach.
Is there a number that I can call you back at, or an email that you'd like?
Here's, I just wanted to note for you that Lewis Johnson has his hand up. I'm trying to keep an eye on that in the panelist list.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Thanks, Craig. Sorry, I'm in the car, so I'm trying to be quick. One thing, and I know Ryan and Ed and John and everybody know this, but I do think is important when we're talking about, whether we're talking about surveys or any sort of public engagement, is how we ask the questions, in that we have to have some way of knowing who's saying what. And I think one of the ways to think about that is by collecting some level of demographic information through the survey. Because if you don't know, maybe you can't pinpoint exactly where people are, but the geographic location might not matter so much as who's saying it. So I think back to this perspective on equitable engagement and thinking about who's giving input, I think that's another thing or tool that can be used to help point back to them.
Confirmations for you, okay?
Chris, this is Cynthia. I'd like to add on to that. I'd just like to say for everybody's benefit that, with Ed and Ryan together with the team, we will be developing a handful of questions. We always ask demographic questions, even if we don't ask spatial questions. The idea is that if the city is willing to promote the survey on their social media pages and on their web pages, our idea is that we try to get the word out as much as possible through different venues in order to expand the types of responses and try to address that equitable engagement piece is super important. But if we don't, we're just going to have to caveat in the analysis, who we didn't hear from and who the responses do reflect the interests of. So I certainly can appreciate your concerns, Mr. Anderson, but I mean, at the end of the day, it does often provide a very solid level of input. And if it's from one group, then at least we report that we have some input from that one group. And hopefully it's not just one group.
I'm good. How are you?
This topic is a decent segue to the analytical tool demo. Can we move on to that portion of the meeting? Mark, you're muted. You laughed a bit though too.
Yes, I think so. I will leave that up to Philip Walters from Urban 3. I believe will start us off on that. You're muted.
Okay, thank you.
How about now?
Thanks.
You're good now.
Okay, so I am going to have to switch off the phone because I'm hearing myself twice. That's my own fault. How about now? We're still good?
We hear you.
Okay, good. And I don't hear myself twice anymore. So I'm going to share my screen quickly, give you a little primer on the way Urban 3 looks at things, and so what we'll be able to show you about Lexington. This is the model, the image that we're so well known for. This is actually from around the world, but the point here is that we're actually able to take a budget, in this case it's the revenue, and put it on a map and take it from some table that nobody ever even wanted to look at to an interesting picture that we can learn a lot from. And this comes from us asking the question of ourselves and our roots in a real estate development company of what's a city? And as you guys know oh so well, it's a finite boundary of land. And eventually maybe you can change or something, but eventually you're going to hit a county boundary and you really just can't go any further. So it all comes down to how you use that space. And we start to talk like farmers, because a farmer can tell you what their yield per acre is, how much labor, seed, energy they had to put in to get that yield out. And so those are trade-offs, and they can choose that. They can use that information to choose, am I going to plant corn this year or wheat this year, cotton, so on. We think about cities the same way. Here's one of our favorite examples, and these are two poles, not unlike the scenarios that we're talking about here. The Walmart is worth $20 million compared to that other kind of multi-story downtown building. That's worth twice as much. But when I look at it like a farmer, when I look at it per acre, I get some very different metrics and trade-offs in hand, and then I can start to decide which thing I want. And I think, to loop this back to your scenario discussion, you don't actually want either pole, but you can learn a lot from those poles and chart your course in between. And I swear that this is not scary math. It's really fifth grade math. And you actually are, I know that this is a whole new way to talk about taxes, right? But you actually already use language like this all the time. And we use it when we talk about miles per gallon. We all know that if you've got a big truck, you've got to fill the big tank, it's got the big tank. But miles per gallon is a very different story. And maybe we don't want what the Aceta has to offer, but it does have the best miles per gallon. And now we know a little more about our trade-offs. My best visual example of this for you is actually from here in Asheville, because we have the nation's biggest house. It's that purple blob. It's the Biltmore estate. It's got a massive, massive value. And we've also got some interesting things like forests that are showing up in gray there. They're non-taxable. They're not contributing to the budget. They do add value. Again, we understand that there are trade-offs. When we do it like at the farmer, when we look at value per acre, it becomes a very different story. And really, you can't see it this way, right? But now you can see that there are some different crops in my county, Buncombe County. And I didn't label downtown because I know you can see where downtown is. It's kind of crop. It's highly productive. It comes with trade-offs. Also out to the far east side of our county is this little downtown, this little city that has its own little crop that's quite productive for it. And then all around the county, you can see all these different development patterns that each have their own trade-offs and their own productivity. And so we can use this existing data about tax revenue, a huge part of what needs to be on the table, to make projections or choices about which track you'd like to go down. Now you're special, and the reason I'm bringing up Rancho Cucamonga is because they use sales tax heavily to fund their city. You have an income tax situation. We would deal with that the same way. We can take their property tax, simplify it, add their sales, in your case it would be income, stack them both up, and we're still back to a fairly complete view of your budget and where your trade-offs are. Who's giving you the most, and do you want more of that or less of that? Could you have more of that? This is the kind of information that we use and the lens that we use to look at any place we go. And here's another example of our work in an actual scenario situation where we took a certain amount of development and added it into very different patterns to that revenue model so that you could, this community, this is another California example, could see, okay, so here's one choice and here's another. Maybe I like this about the choice on this side and I don't like that, but they become highly instructive. And of course, these would come with numbers that you could use and numbers that your staff will be able to use going forward to chart, as we keep talking about, to chart that course where you're headed. I know that was very fast. Oh, and I forgot, I always like to mention, we like to talk about ourselves as the accountant. And I love that this study is structuring up, as Mark has talked about, to divorce the political decision from the numbers decision. I'm not going to tell you what you should do, but like your accountant, I'm going to tell you what it looks like you can and can't afford, and then you're going to make your decisions. I probably am not moving to Lexington. I'll talk to my wife, but I don't think I am. This is your community. I just want to be the best accountant I can for you so that you're in the best position to make it the community you want it to be. That's the Urban 3 approach in the shortest amount of time I've ever told that story. But I didn't want to belabor the point too long, because what I really want to do is get into your data and be able to show you what the story looks like for you.
How do you I'd cut in. How do you address equity, or an equitable? We talked about tax generation, and we're income tax based, but certain people don't make as much as other people in certain areas. There's those people live, and they're obviously as or more important. So how do you address that?
Well, I'm Josh. I'm also at Urban 3, and you mind if I jump in?
Go ahead, Josh.
One is we're not gonna know as well until we actually map the data and see what it tells us, and we'll see what pattern emerges. And as far as the income tax data goes, we haven't gotten it yet, but from my understanding, when we do, it'll be more based on employment patterns than where people live. And so the places where people have lower income it's not really gonna show up in the income data, I don't think. And it's a deeper question of equity. One of the things I think, I don't know how much we'll get into when we have the data, the data is going to show us in the pattern some of these things, and when they emerge, we're gonna try to tell that story. And whenever we have one of these models, this is one behind me here, and we find things that are surprising, like you see this, I'm backwards from where I'm pointing, so over there it is. I'll point to it with my left shoulder there. This spike that appears right here, we see something like that in the community. We'll look at that and say, what's going on there? Same with when we see dips in the property values. Well, what's going on there? In a lot of cases, that has to do with history. It has to do with things like redlining, and really all of the policies and history that got your city to the point it is right now. We'll try to figure out what those steps were and what lessons they teach us about the decisions you're going to make in the future.
Vice Mayor Kay, did you have something to say?
I think it covered some of it, but I think to state the obvious, our tax base is 65% payroll and net profits. And that not only does it not necessarily track geographically, although it does a lot, but a half of that comes from outside the county. So we're unusual in that respect, and I don't know how you account for that in the work you do, but I'm sure you'll help us understand that. So thank you.
Do the best we can.
Dennis?
I don't know that land use, everybody says, and I'm usually the free enterprise guy, and I'm the one that hates to hear them say, well, government isn't a business. And I find myself wanting to say, government isn't a business. I don't know that we should be using tax generation to decide land use. I think we need to look at community needs. What does the community need? Does it need housing? Does it need jobs? It certainly doesn't need more retail or office right now. But the base land use on tax revenue is backwards. We ought to adjust the taxes to the use, not the use to the tax. I'll keep an open mind, look forward to hearing the report. Hopefully I'll deem something better from it. But right now I'm skeptical.
You raise a point that I sometimes skip over, and that's a problem I have. I'll try to work on it. To me, the taxes are nothing but your ability to, as I like to call it, buy a boat, but do whatever it is your community wants to do. At the end of the day, you've got to pay for it. And if you want your city to do a lot, right, then you've got to find a way to do it. And if you don't like the way these models look, then you've hit on one of the realistic options. Is you could actually change your tax structure because it is what it is right now, and I'll be able to show you that. And if you don't like that, by all means, use our work to leverage a different tax structure that is what your community wants. But I should roll back and remind myself that there's no profit to be had, right? A city in our sense is the most interesting corporation because pretty much all of your owners and customers are almost all the same people, right? So it is a corporation technically, but it's the most unusual kind compared to anything you'd find on the stock market, right? But yeah, we'll of course get into this deeper.
And I want to add to that this is only one piece of of what that framework will include. And so your decision making in the end will be based on many more factors on top of how each individual land use and performs fiscally for LFUCG. There'll be more things that go into that as you consider making decisions about changing land use and at some point in time potentially changing the urban service boundary. That you'll have to weigh several different things.
And if I could interject, one other aspect of this is going back to the equity question. I think, it seems almost like any accountancy or economist analysis, it seems almost cold-hearted to say, oh, it all comes down to numbers. But often the decisions we make, we are basing them on completely false understandings of what the who's bearing the costs and who's actually reaping the benefits. I think the first slide from Philip was the Walmart versus the town development. They pay less taxes, but use up more of your land and require more of your resources. That's fine if everybody wants the convenience of Walmart as they prefer to do their business, but that's not necessarily the way people perceive the deal going down. And I think some of this from an equity standpoint, it's not just the tax revenue that you'll see from these models. You also see the costs, how the city is outlaying its finite resources to support all of these land uses. And that's the visualization is very good at helping people kind of recognize not only what they may have misunderstood or like misrepresented in their own mind, but also recognize what they prefer. So I think there's an opportunity from the equity standpoint for us to see that there might be folks that are in inner city neighborhoods that are by all relevance perception, oh, these are non-performing areas, but they're actually contributing to the tax base at a level that what we consider high-performing areas are not. And is that, like when we can see that visually, there's an equity question that we get to see more clearly than we did before. Philip, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's perfectly well said. That we find those surprises, and I'm sure we'll find one or two in Lexington that something that we think of as even a poor neighborhood can in fact be more tax productive, even when we adjust for relatively higher or lower levels of service.
I look forward to seeing the information. That's very interesting. Thank you. If we could now move on to comments from task force members, we would ask that everyone limit their comments to 3 minutes or less. Anyone out there on the task force that would like to comment?
Mark, I have one other thing I want to ask you. As far as the data that you're looking at, is there a piece of it when you do finally look at areas within the urban service boundary that is to build on or whatever, are you looking at the cost of sewers that are not there or things like that the city will have to provide before that? Is that a piece of it as well?
Yes, we will have to develop some basic heuristic measurements for the cost of new infrastructure, but also perhaps upgraded infrastructure. I mean, a lot of particularly the maximum efficiency standard can't really happen unless we redo the infrastructure to accommodate higher densities, or just even bring it back up to where it needs to be today. So yes. Obviously, we're going to be using a lot of rule of thumb guidelines on that. We don't have the depth in this study to analyze every single project or every single type of development, but that'll be a component, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Are we ready to go to public comment now? Do we have any other comments from the task force? Craig, can you open it up to public comment now?
Certainly. If you are attending and viewing the webinar and would like to make any comments, please raise your hand, raise the blue hand, and I will call out your name to be brought into the meeting for discussion. I'm not seeing any.
With that said,
we do have one. Amy Clark has raised her hand. I will, if it's okay with the chairs, I will move her. I'll promote her to panelist so she can speak.
Please do so. And again, we're asking for a 3-minute limit on public comment.
Ms. Clark, are you there?
She's muted.
I'm requesting that she unmutes.
There you go.
Ms.
Thank
Clark,
you.
are you there?
Yes. I'm sorry. I would try to show my face, but I can't seem to discover how. But thank you. This is very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to this sort of data you can develop. I'm particularly interested in balancing different land uses that are desired, meeting the needs for housing use, for jobs, increasing jobs, and so on. And I'm wondering whether you will have a mechanism to actually measure things that the comp plan policies and that the comp plan is already implementing. For example, there was a revision, amendment of the commercial zone, what we call a shopping center zone. And it had goals of increasing housing and increasing FAR. And so I'm wondering, will you get to that granular level where you're saying, well, these policies were implemented and this is the outcome 2 years down the road and so forth. But in general, I'd love to learn more about the balancing of land uses and what sort of metrics you're going to apply. Thank you.
Well,
Chairs,
yes.
we have one additional person with a hand up, Brittany Rothmeyer. I will bring her into the meeting as well.
I think it would be reasonable if Mark has a response to Mrs. Clark's question for Mark to respond. And I think, Mrs. Clark, if I Googled the right person, your input from your profession on future meetings would be very valuable.
I do believe, to answer your question, I do believe we are going to be attempting to, especially as a part of scenario 2, really look into what those explicit policies are, working with the planning staff, what they've implemented, getting as much data as we can about their effects of those plan implementations, and carrying them forward, again, as a good faith interpretation of how effective they are. So yes, I think that is one of the strategic goals of setting up these scenarios, is really talking to the various experts, so to speak, the stakeholders that know best. And in case of 1 and 2, that's going to really be the planning staff, because they are at this point the keepers of the data, the people that have worked with the policy the closest, and to the extent of like understanding their success rate or their interpretation of how their policies have been implemented so far, we would definitely want to include that in our scenario development. And then that kind of gets back to the original point of all of this, is to understand those metrics. So like FAR, that could be one of the metrics that we eventually say is a critical or essential piece of our evaluation framework, is how have we changed our FAR by land use over time, or like since, compared from one scenario to another. And in a way, to me, that is as relevant, is that I can't necessarily say exactly what criteria we will identify, because that's the kind of the point of the study, especially in the next 3 or 4 months, to really go down that path and talk to folks like you, talk to other experts, and figure out like what is actually driving development, what's actually the aspects of the planning policy that we need to fully understand and fully incorporate into the framework for the framework to be effective.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing that data. I think it's, a great service that it will be data, I guess, that will be available to any of us to have a look at.
Very, very correct. Very correct. Thank you. Craig, you said there was one other person out there for public comment?
Yes, Brittany Rothmeyer. I brought her into the meeting. I'm muting her right now. So, Ms. Rothmeyer, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Craig. I appreciated being here today and appreciate the work of the task force and everyone that's on this call today. I guess I just want to say that there was a lot of discussion today about the subjective aspects of this study and the surveys and then the public input on the growth scenarios and things. But I suppose I hope that the main emphasis can remain upon the objective data portion. And because the objective data that can really inform the community's decision-making. And that's such an important piece, especially as some of the task force members have acknowledged, we have faced difficulties in implementation of the policies that were approved by the community in the comprehensive plan in Imagine Lexington. And I think that it's such critical work of this task force to discover and appoint the objective data that can help inform the community about why the policies that are being suggested pursuant to Imagine Lexington or other land use policies that are being promoted by the city are so important. And I think if this task force and Stantec and their work can really establish that criteria and those objective data points, that educating the community and helping them make informed decisions about supporting the policies that go towards our land use decisions, understanding the economics of land use and what it costs our community based upon the way that we grow is so important. And I just hope that the majority of the emphasis of the task force and its work can be on that objective part that inform any objective pieces that we'll get every 5 years as we continue to do our comprehensive plan. So thanks for all your work, and I look forward to continuing to tune in.
Very good point, Brittany. Thank you so much.
Greg, is there anyone else out there?
I am not seeing any other hands raised for public comment.
Right.
So when is our next meeting scheduled, Craig?
Your next meeting is scheduled for November the 18th, again at 3 p.m. Via Zoom webinar in all likelihood. So we will continue to keep everybody on the task force informed as this continues to move forward. We may ask for some input directly from you, some opinions via email regarding some of those stakeholder lists and so on, if that would be acceptable to you all.
Absolutely.
And we will, like I said, we'll keep you informed as this continues to move forward and provide regular updates.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Mark, and your team for all your good input today. It's very informational, and I think we're on the road finally.
Thank you.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We will see you in November.